Hello and welcome to Production Bites. I'm your host Veranova, and today I'm going to be looking at preparing your track for mastering. So mastering is the final stage of audio production to prepare the audio for the format it's going to be distributed on. Back in the days of vinyl, this meant processing the audio so that there were no huge jumps in level, which would cause the needle to jump in the groove, and was important in those days because of the lower dynamic range and higher noise floor of analog formats, meaning that the audio needed to have a reduced dynamic range to support the format. These days there's less to do with digital formats because they don't really have the same limitations that analog formats had. But mastering engineers generally have much higher quality and more expensive equipment, and a better set of ears than most engineers. So they're still an important part of the chain in terms of correcting frequency balance problems, correcting odd mix problems, which the engineer who mixed it may not have noticed, and then compressing and limiting the track to bring it up to a commercial level of loudness. So the first thing that you need to think about when you're preparing your track for mastering is what effects you've put on the master bus. As a general rule, creative effects on the master bus are okay, however corrective effects intended to fix problems in your mix are best left to the mastering engineer because they have better equipment and ears to judge what sounds right. Instead, if you think you've got mix problems, then try to fix them in the mix on individual tracks instead of on your master bus, because the mastering engineer won't have the opportunity to do that. Something a lot of people use on their buses is master bus compression, and if you're using this to make your track sound louder, it's probably worth taking it off, but if you're using it to glue together the track, by all means leave it on. However, consider whether the mastering engineer might be able to do a better job of it, and you can always give him an uncompressed raw track with no effects on the master, and a version of your track which has bus compression on it. And that way he can have a listen to the bus compressed one and judge what kind of sound you were going for and how you wanted to glue the mix together. Corrective EQ is best left to the mastering engineer, but if you've got some creative EQ on there, such as a filter sweep, then leave that on as that's part of your track and how it should sound, and the mastering engineer won't be able to replicate that so easily. So as a general guide, take off any effects which are designed to make the track sound louder or fix problems with the mix, as all of this falls under the mastering engineer's job. The next thing to think about is how you top and tail your track. And what this is where you start the export of your track at the beginning and where you end it. Something to remember is because at mastering you're bringing up the level of the track, tails also get brought up in level. So you may have thought a tail at the end of the track had faded out, but in fact it's still fading out when you stop the export. So always give yourself a few seconds before you think the track has started and a few seconds after you think the track has ended inside the export. The mastering engineer will top and tail himself, and he can also create fades for you after he's compressed the track. And as with the uncompressed raw version of the track you may give him for bus compression, you can also put your own fades onto that so he has an idea of how you want the track to fade in and out. The penultimate thing you need to think about is headroom and how much to give. Effects which mastering engineers add will bring up the levels of the audio, so they need some extra headroom for this to happen without clipping. The big rule is never to let your audio hit 0 decibels. This is clipping and the mastering engineer can't fix clipping. But aside from that rule, the rest is only really a guideline. Try to keep your peaks of your audio around 6 to 12 decibels below 0, as this gives plenty of headroom for the mastering engineer to work with, and it doesn't reduce the quality of the audio at all, because you should be exporting in 24-bit. So once you've prepared your track for export, the next thing to think about is the format to export in. And this one's a relatively easy one to do, as it's just selecting options, but knowing why you need to choose these options is a bit more of a difficult subject. So when exporting, you need to export as a lossless audio format. Now, engineers will normally ask for a WAV file, but you could also use AIFF, which is a variant of WAV. You should export at your project's native sample rate, which is normally 44.1 kHz, but you can also run projects in a lot of DAWs in 48 kHz, 88 kHz, 96 kHz, or 192 kHz. But the most common is 44.1, and a lot of DAWs don't even give you a choice to export at a different sample rate. But the reason you do this is because the mastering engineer will have much better equipment to convert between sample rates, so it's worth leaving it to them. Something to set which is only in FL Studio is the resampling drop-down menu, which you just need to set to 512 point sync for a final export, as this affects the quality of pitch-shifted samples. Another thing to look out for when you're exporting a track for mastering is dithering. You should switch off dithering because it's only really needed for final tracks, as it adds a noise floor to stop any sound flutter when the level gets down to such a low level that it starts to flick between a registerable sample and 0 samples in amplitude. And obviously, because your levels are going to be brought up at mastering, you don't want there to be an additional noise floor already there. That should really be added at the end of the mastering chain. Lastly, engineers will almost always ask for a 24-bit file. Bit depth is the amplitude resolution of audio, effectively like looking at the number of vertical pixels in a photo. 24-bit has just over 16 million possible points a sample can be set at in amplitude, whereas 16-bit, which is CD quality audio and what most people will export WAV at, is just over 65,000 points. So imagine 24-bit audio as a 16 million pixel high image, and 16-bit audio as a 65,000 pixel high image. So because you're giving 6 to 12 decibels of headroom on your track, you're not using the full dynamic range of 16-bit audio, effectively like not using the top part of an image to store your image in, which means the audio is less true to the original sound because of the lower resolution you're effectively using. If you give the engineer 24-bit audio, however, then although you're not using the full dynamic range of 24-bit audio, the range used is still going to be much higher than that of 16-bit, which is the end format. So applying mastering processes in 24-bit means that you can reduce the bit depth afterwards and have a recording which has always used a higher number of bits for its dynamic range than is available in 16-bit. So you're using 16-bit to its full potential at the end product. So that's it for this episode of Production Bytes. If you have any requests for future tutorials and reviews, then head over to our Facebook page and leave a comment suggesting them. And don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. See you next time.